In Chapter 16, in the last video, we looked at monetary policy, and now in Chapter 18, we're going to look at fiscal policy. Monetary policy changes in the money supply that affects spending. Fiscal policy changes in the government's budget that we hope will affect spending and the aggregate demand curve. So, for example, running a budget deficit, tax cuts, spending increases, all the things we think about, we talked about in the earlier chapter with the institutions of fiscal policy are in play here. And so the question is, what can we do with fiscal policy? What should we do with fiscal policy? Let's talk about some of the concerns about fiscal policy first. In general, right, one of the concerns we have is what we call crowding out. If government borrows in order to spend, to engage in spending, to boost aggregate demand, yet we're at or near full employment, the concern is that government spending and borrowing is just going to crowd out private sector borrowing. So if government spends more, that's an increase in aggregate demand. But if that spending activity just pushes out private spending, then the effect on aggregate demand is perhaps nothing, right? So if government's hiring employees that would have been hired or are already hired by the private sector, the net gain from the government spending and the fiscal policy is very little. The interesting question comes in, what happens if we're not at full employment? That is, if there are idle resources, if there's idle capital, machines sitting around, and idle workers, unemployment around. Now what happens? Well, the question here is the question of what's known as the fiscal multiplier. Right? The argument is if government spends money and hires those employees, let's say, who otherwise wouldn't have been hired by the private sector, it hires those employees get paid, they spend on other things, new people get income, they spend, and we get this sort of multiplier effect from the original spending. And the argument for fiscal policy is if there are a lot of idle resources sitting around, a lot of high unemployment or idle capital, that the effects of the multiplier will be high. And in fact, the question for fiscal policy is a comparison between the effects of the multiplier and the effects of crowding out. If the multiplier effect is significantly stronger, then it looks like fiscal policy is going to be more effective. If the crowding out effect is stronger, then fiscal policy is a waste. The interesting question, however, here, I think, and one of the things that's often ignored in these discussions is when we have idle resources, we can't treat those idle resources as being sort of a kind of homogeneous lump or like a bowl of stew or soup or something that we just sort of ladle out, right? So, for example, if government wants to spend on building new roads and bridges, right, one has to hope that the machinery and human resources that are idle are ones that are appropriate for those infrastructure projects. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Right? If you're going to spend money on infrastructure, yet the people who are unemployed are financial consultants and experts, say in hedge fund management, right? They're not going to be the ones who are going to be building those bridges for you, right? So one of the challenges facing fiscal policy is if government's going to spend money on particular projects, it has to have the resources available to it that are appropriate to that project. If it doesn't, it's going to be wasteful. And many of the models, unfortunately, that economists use, and certainly that politicians use in the way politicians talk, right? Remember, shovel-ready projects. The way politicians talk, it's as if, well, there's just these resources out there, and whatever we spend on, we just pull those resources in, they'll be ready to go. It doesn't work that way, right? In the real world, both human labor and machinery, it has specificity to it. Not every worker can do every job, and not every machine can make every good. So part of the problem facing fiscal policymakers is if they're going to spend on particular projects, those projects have to align with the resources that are available, the human capital and the physical capital that's available to work on them. You can think of lots of reasons why that might not be the case. Same thing as we talked about with monetary policy. We face knowledge and incentive problems here. The knowledge problem is, how do government agents know? How does Congress know? How do others know what the skills of those idle resources are and what the capacity of the idle machinery is? Even if we assume their best intentions, how do they know what they have to work with, right? And how do they know what is needed, and how do they get those aligned together? So there's a knowledge problem, but there's also, as we've talked about, an incentive problem. And here's our public choice considerations coming in again. The kinds of projects that might be appropriate to spend on as part of fiscal policy that are aligned with the actual skills and capacities of human and physical capital, right, might not be ones that are beneficial to politicians. They might not get votes. Right? And conversely, the things that politicians might want to spend on that will get them votes and get them returned to office might have nothing to do with the capacities of the physical capital and the skills of the human capital. So when we say government should spend more money, should engage in deficit spending in order to stimulate the economy, right? And I'm going to come back to that word stimulate in a second, right? What does that mean if we face these knowledge and incentive problems? For that to work, you have to know what the resources are that are available, right, and know them well. And then it has to be the case that the kind of program that would match them is in the incentive of actual real living politicians to execute. That's a tough challenge to meet, just like we talked about the challenges facing monetary policy. Let me say a quick word about that word stimulate the economy. Hopefully by now it's clear the economy is not a machine. It's not a sort of a body that reacts like to a stimulant, right? It's about human beings making choices. It's about human beings recognizing the knowledge and incentives they have in front of them and having to decide based on that how to choose, what to do, and then dealing with the unintended consequences of those choices. It's not a machine you can sort of give an electric shock to, and it's not like a test subject, right, where you shock it and get a predictable result, right? That's not how economies are. That language of stimulation is so mechanistic and so forth that I think we want to avoid it, right? The question here is whether or not fiscal policy can boost aggregate demand in a way that increases output, lowers unemployment in ways we might like. One other problem that fiscal policy faces that the book discusses is what's known as the Ricardian Equivalence theorem, named after David Ricardo, the famous classical economist from the beginning of the 19th century. What Ricardian Equivalence argues is if people see fiscal policy happening and know the consequences of that policy, they will take actions that offset it. The easiest example of this, right, is if government starts to spend more and run a larger deficit and increase its debt, people will realize that eventually their taxes are going to have to go up to pay for that. So what will they do? They will save more money to be able to pay those future taxes. The fact that they save more and consume less means they're spending less. That offsets the deficit spending coming from government, and the effects of that fiscal policy are neutralized. Same with a tax cut, right? With a tax cut, you might, well, people have more money, will have more money in hand, but they also know that might increase the deficit. They save some, right? The effects are neutralized. So Ricardian equivalence, and there's a big debate, as you might imagine, among economists, whether it's true and how true it is and how powerful it is. But to the extent it is true, right, that's another challenge faced by fiscal policy makers. That if people if people's behavior in response to the policy are offsetting the effects of the policy, then the policy seems like a bad idea. And as we mentioned in the discussion of monetary policy, right, both monetary and fiscal policy face lags. There's the same lags that we talked about with monetary policy apply here. A recognition lag, at the time it takes to recognize there's a problem. A legislative lag, Congress has to decide that it has to propose and then decide what sort of legislation it will pass. Implementation lag. It takes time for the bureaucracy to implement the actual spending or whatever else fiscal policy that government has passed. Then there's an effectiveness lag. It takes time for whatever that executed plan, once it's actually happening, to work, to have its effect, or effectiveness lag. And then finally, the evaluation and adjustment lag. Did it work? And if so, what do we do? And again, the problem facing fiscal policy is the same one as monetary policy. If you don't account for those lags, you may end up being pro-cyclical instead of counter-cyclical. And as the book points out, the lags facing monetary policy are weaker than the lags facing fiscal policy. Fiscal policy it's more complicated, the lags are longer, so that really matters. So one of the other problems, right, if we want to execute fiscal policy, we have to deal with those lags. One other thing to think about with fiscal policy is what are known as automatic stabilizers. Okay, fiscal policy automatically changes to keep private spending higher during bad times and lower during good times. It's easiest to think about the bad times. So, for example, when we're in a recession, government is going to be, people are going to be unemployed and be out of work and so forth, and government's going to be spending more on transfer payments. So that's an automatic boost, right, to spending that comes from government policy. Okay, and there's no need to sort of kind of pass that or do anything about it. It's automatic, right? We have a recession, people are unemployed, government spends more. So that's one form of fiscal policy that we might note here. The other thing we might think about here is the difference or the comparison between government spending and tax cuts as ways to boost aggregate demand. Okay, um, and as we've suggested, right, politics matters here. Tax cuts put the spending in the hands of the private sector. Government spending keeps it in government. Okay, we might believe, for reasons, that private sector actors will spend that money in wiser ways. That spending is decentralized when it's spent in private hands. So some of the knowledge problems that we were talking about with government spending don't apply. So tax cuts have an advantage that way over government spending. There might be things that in theory would be good things for government to spend on, for example, again, things like infrastructure or science funding. That would make a stronger case for government spending if we think the private sector won't do it. However, public choice considerations are important here. We might say, yes, if we pass this big government spending plan and we spend it on X, Y, and Z, that would be good. But by the time it works its way through Congress, do we really think members of Congress, right, will have the incentive to spend on those things and not other kinds of things? That's a question I think that's worth thinking about. At the end of the day, fiscal policy is really only effective if certain conditions hold. Okay, and it's worth discussing what those conditions are, because when we have to ask ourselves, right, are those conditions likely to hold in the real world in ways that we think make fiscal policy a good choice. Okay, so the book lists 4, and I'm going to mention all 4 of them. The book argues fiscal policy will be more effective when government needs a short-run boost, even at the expense of long-run growth. Okay. A second condition is it's a deficiency in aggregate demand rather than a real shock. Same sorts of some similar considerations we talked about with monetary policy. It will work. Fiscal policy will work better when resources are unemployed. Okay. And if the stimulus can be, if the spending can be targeted towards those particular unemployed resources. And finally, if government spending is, quote, efficient and productive, it makes more sense to do fiscal policy. Fiscal policy would be stronger. In all of those 4 things we've just talked about, the question is, are they likely to occur? And when we think seriously about public choice considerations and the incentives facing politicians, and then also the knowledge problems facing politicians, how often are a majority of those even going to be true? And so our skepticism about fiscal policy might be well grounded in the fact that it looks good on paper, but how well does it work in practice? And here too, we might think about the same rules versus discretion debate that we had with monetary policy. Fiscal policymakers have discretion. Governments can run budget deficits and deficit spend all they want. And so one way perhaps to keep them in check is something like a balanced budget rule or agreement, or even a constitutional amendment that forces the federal government to keep a balanced budget. You might think about what some of the consequences of that would be and why it might be preferred to discretion, and what the cost would be, very similar to what we looked at in Chapter 16 with monetary policy. So those are some considerations with fiscal policy. In general, there's a lot of skepticism about the effectiveness of fiscal policy. But still, that doesn't mean we want to rule it out altogether necessarily. The question simply is going to be, how often is it that the conditions necessary are going to hold with a realistic understanding of political actors? And the answer there is probably not very often, if ever.